page 4 of the printouts. That's Ois Daled, page Ches. I'm sorry, I forgot to put this up on the WhatsApp. We're holding on Ois Daled after speaking about the idea of the Pnimius, that we have the Avodah Pnimius of a Yid, we have the level of Torah mitzvahs. That is the Das Chadorim Yimalu and Besvuna Yikainen. But then there's the idea of the building of the house itself, the edifice itself, the house itself has to be in such a type of way of protected in a way of makif, because Torah and Tefillah, we said, is a level of the Oir Pnimi. The Mezuzah, that is the Hamshach of the Oir Makif. That's something that comes around, just like a protection is an Oir Makif that protects from outside, from the encircling, and that's Chochma Yibana Bayis, and that's what it says, that even though there's the level of Boin of Boy, but Shav Shakad, but without Hashem Yivna Bayis, the Boin of Boy doesn't help. There needs to be the level of the mezuzah, the Amshachas HaMakif. And we said the Amshachas HaMakif, how does that come about? That's through the Avodah that's L'mayla Matam Vadas, because the Avodah that's beyond Tam Vadas, the Avodah of Kabbalas oil, reaches the level of Makif, which is higher than Seder Ishtalshus. The Avodah Pnimis has to do with the level of Shapitam Vadas, reaches the level of the Oir Pnimi, and throwing down the Makif that comes about through the Avodah of Kabbalas oil. And that has to do with what we said before, Hashem Yishmer Hine Lo Yonav L'Yishur Shomer Yisrael, the Shomer Yisrael, the level of Shomer that's higher than Shem Havaya, but that Shomer Yisrael also has to come in through and via Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. So he says in Ois Dalet, line 22, on the 4th page, page Ches, Hine Shem Shadvarim Amurim B'Negea L'Inyan Abayis. Just like the matter is set, this concept of needing the makif on top of the pnimi, in addition to the pnimi, concerning the idea of the bias. Hein habayis, the klolos ha'olam, whether we're talking about the bias of the general world, that the whole Seder Ishtalshelus is likened to habayis. The whole world is likened to habayis. The whole Seder Ishtalshelus is likened to habayis. Hein habayis haprotish kolech miYisrael, so too it's concerning and also consider the individual house of every single Yid. That's not just enough to have a bias mali svarim, that the home inside is filled with svarim, but to answer the question that we had at the beginning of the Maimer from the Tzemach Tzedek, why, if it's a Jewish home already, do we need to put mezuzahs on the doorpost as well? But we need to have that because that's the Kabbalas oil, because the first two parshas or of Kriyashma, which is the two parshas that are included in the mezuzah, talk about Kabbalas oil Malchus Shamayim. It talks about Kabbalas oil mitzvahs, accepting the yoke of heaven by Shema Yisrael Shem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And the second parsha is V'hoyim Shemaya Tishmu. That's the idea of the Kabbalas oil of mitzvahs. So through Kabbalas oil, we tap into that Shmira. So that is both for a home as Seder Ishtalshelus and the home of every individual Yid. Now the Rebbe brings this also concerning in Avodah. So that's a third aspect where there's the Koiches Pnimium and there's the level of the Makif. So he says in line 24, came to Gam B'Negia Lo Adam Atzmei. So too it's concerning the person himself. A person is obligated to say that for my sake the world was created. So therefore, if you have the entire world needs to have this level of the shmira on the bayis. So the same thing, the purpose of this world, the miniature world, which is the person, also needs to have, in addition to the pnimi, it needs the mezuzah, it needs the shmira and bachutz, the level of the makif. Line 26, the idea behind this is it's known concerning the descent of neshama into the body. There is 4 general levels of the neshama goes through to be able to come to before it comes to into this body. The neshama shnasata be tahiri. First level is the neshama you placed in me, it's pure. Ata barasa, you created her, that's the second level. Ata yitzarta, you formed her, the third level. Vata nafachta be, you blew her into me, that's the fourth level. Shehem keneged arba oisis shem havaya. These correspond to the four letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei. Like we said before, Yud Kei Vav Kei is the level that has to do with Seder Ishtalshlus. Seder Ishtalshlus is not enough. You need to have beyond Yud Kei Vav Kei, you need to have beyond Seder Ishtalshlus for the Shmirah. So that's why after we say Neshama Shnasata Bi Tahiri Ata Barasai Yitzarta Vata Nefachta Bi Ola Achrei Zeh Yesh Layin Data Meshamar Bekirbi. Following that, in addition to that whole Amshacha through Seder Ishtalshlus, there needs to be the Shmirah, there needs to be the Shomer Yisrael, Loyon of Leish and Shomer Yisrael that we said that's higher than Shem Havaya, higher than Seder Ishtalshlus. The same thing, every person has the Atam Meshamra Bekirbi. What is the level of Atam Meshamra Bekirbi? Shenim Shach Mebchina Shalamayla Gam Bebchinas Tahira. He comes from a level, top of page test, that's even higher than the level of Tahirahi, Bechinas Tihiru Ilah Ulamaylam Hazeh. Tahirahi is, as we mentioned in, I believe we learned this in a previous Maimer, either a week or two ago, that Tahirahi is Tihiru Ilah, the supernal purity and brilliance that goes usually on the level of Lifnei Atzimtzum, and that's how far up the Neshama reaches. But that is still considered part of the Seder Ishtalshlus of the Neshama. Whereas Va'ata Meshamra Bekirbi is higher even than the level of Tehira Ilah, even higher than that level where the Neshama comes from originally. In the language of the Medrash, Chamisha Shemis Nikrulam, the Neshama is called by 5 names. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida. What does this mean to say that it has 5 names? It's indicating 5 levels, which means that 4 levels alone are insufficient. It's insufficient, the 4 levels of Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, which in general correspond to Yud Kei Vav Kei, or the 4 worlds of Atzilus B'ri Yitzir Asiyah. In other words, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya has to do with Seder Ishtalshlus. There's also necessary to have the level of Yechid. Now, having the levels, that's something that Hashem gives us. What does this mean in our avodah? Like we started off saying, we need to see what this idea of the mezuzah, the kabbalah soil, the makif is in the avodah nefesh adam. The idea in avodah of having also the 5th level, the level that's beyond Seder Ishtalshlus, the level of the makif. Even after we have the avodah with all your heart and with all your soul, that b'chol nafshcha means b'chol eser koiches hanefesh, that it permeates and that it has to do and elevates all the 10 soul powers, meaning all the koiches pnimim of the person are affected and are there. This is still insufficient. There has to be also the avodah of b'chol moedecha. What does it mean b'chol moedecha? B'chol midah hu moeded lecha. One of the explanations of b'chol moedecha is it should be read as if it's supposed to be saying midah. In every measure that he measures to you, so you shall do for him. So the Rebbe explains, this is an avodah that's beyond any type of measure and boundary, which is very interesting. Usually when he wants to talk about B'chol Moedecha being L'mayla Mibdidav Agbola, he usually brings the idea of Ma'oid. Ma'oid is very much so, without limitations, Tov Ma'oid, etc., etc. Here he brings the other taich of B'chol Moedecha. B'chol Moedecha means B'chol Midah. This means Beligvul. So the idea, what has to do with Beligvul, on the side commentary he explains, because it shows a complete devotion to Hashem, meaning not that you are, it's not just, as we often translate it as it measure for measure, but rather b'chol midah shu moeded lach, meaning under any circumstance. Similar to what the Chazal say, Kishem shemevorach ala toiva, kach mevorach, on the opposite. Just like a person makes a bracha and thanks Hashem for the good, he's supposed to thank Hashem for the opposite of good, which means that's the idea of b'chol midah shu moeded lacha, that whatever measure a person receives from Hashem, regardless if it is good or chas v'shalom the other way, he still connects to Hashem, which is a very powerful devotion to Hashem beyond reason and knowledge. Because often, when things go good, then the connection is strong, and when things don't go good, we could fall apart. Or sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes when we are not getting what we want, we're begging Hashem, and when everything is going smoothly, we forget about Hashem. Vayishman yishunum vayivot. The idea that a person, regardless of the situation, whether things are going good or the opposite of it, he is always fixated and always obsessed and always connected with Hashem, that breaks beyond boundaries. So that's the difference. B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha. B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha is the normal koiches pnimim, like he's soon going to say, the ones that have to do with nefesh, ruach, neshama. Whereas b'chol meidecha, that's the level of beyond Seder Ishtalshus. Let's see it inside, line 11. Ach mikol makim tzarech liyas gam ha'avoida de b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha. One shouldn't say that the b'chol meidecha is enough. Going beyond the avoida of Seder Ishtalshus is enough. But it has to be also with all your heart, with all your soul, with all the esrei kochas nefesh, with your love of Hashem, with your love also your nefesh abamis. It's in the avoida of the inner soul powers we have to do. On this itself, there has to be the idea of the devotion to Hashem that's beyond Seder Ishtalshus. We mentioned this earlier in the Maimer, that even when you have the level of Loyanam V'Yishon Shomer Yisrael, that Loyanam V'Yishon Shomer Yisrael is beyond Seder Ishtalshus, because it's the idea of the Shmira that comes higher than Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. Because from Yud Kei Vav Kei there could be Ura Lamas Ishon Avaya, we have to call out Hashem and Kaviyachal awaken Hashem, because he appears to be in a state of sleep, but Shomer Yisrael is higher than that. But that itself, the higher than Seder Ishtalshus, the higher than Shem Havaya, that Rebbe said earlier in the Maimer, this also has to come down through and in Shem Havaya, that even though we have Layan V'Yishon Shomer Yisrael, there still has to be what's connected with the Shmira of the Bayis, like we said before, and the Shmira of the home, that it says, Havaya Yishmar Tzeischa V'Yecha. That Havaya has to, the level of the Seder Ishtalshus is the one that brings out that it will guard your goings and comings. So even though Shmira is beyond Seder Ishtalshus, but it comes through Seder Ishtalshus. And the same thing we say, Im Havaya lo yishmar ir. Even though the Shmira comes from higher than Seder Ishtalshus, it has to go through Seder Ishtalshus. So the same thing in the person. It's not just enough to have the B'chol Moedech, the level of the Makif, the level that transcends, the level of that's higher than Seder Ishtalshus, that's beyond reason, but that itself has to be with the koiches pnimi. And the Rebbe gives an example from the relationship between mitzvahs and the Kabbalah's oil. So he says in line 14, Val derech shegam b'mitzvahs pratis tzarech liyos klolos ha'inyan the Kabbalah's oil mitzvahs. Also in the specific individual mitzvahs, there has to be the general idea that I'm accepting the yoke of the mitzvahs. I can't be so engaged and involved in the mitzvahs that I completely forget about that I'm doing this because it's the mitzvah of Hashem. Therefore, even in the mitzvahs, which is the inyan of the pnimius dik avoda, there is what says in the mezuzah, the Kabbalah's oil mitzvahs, the parsha v'hoyim shemoya, that you need to have the makif, the way it permeates, the level that's higher than the Seder Shtalshlus, the way it permeates the Seder Shtalshlus, the Koiches Pnimim. So that comes back to the pasuk that we said at the beginning of the Maimer, line 16. V'zo im Hashem lo yivna bayis shav omlu boinav bay. If Hashem won't build a home, for nothing the builders toiled in it. And we asked at the beginning of the Maimer, the fact that Torah calls them builders, that means Torah's emes says that they're really building. It's not a not building. But yet still and always say that even though the building is a true building, we need to have that Hashem should be building the home, meaning, in this case, that you put up the mezuzah, that's the building of Hashem. What does that mean, Navoidam? What's the building that are the boinov, and what's the building that Hashem is building? So it says on line 17, Shagam la'achri have been in the arba b'chinos shemon sham, even after the building of the 4 levels of an neshama. Shezoi klolos ha'avoida shal pitam b'das, when we do with the building with nefesh, ruach, neshama, and chaya, that's in general the avoida, that's logical and rational. And that's boinov. That is the ones who are building the building. And on top of that, in addition to that, there has to be the level that Hashem is building the home. That's the idea that you are guarding the neshama within me, that is the makif that's higher than Seder Shtalshlus. And we connected that earlier in the Maimer, that is a protection that's through the mezuzah, because the mezuzah affects the amshach of the makif, because in avoida, that's the idea of the accepting of the yoke of heaven and the yoke of mitzvahs, which is the themes of the first and second parsha of Krishma that's written in the mezuzah. And we also connected it with the word mezuzah as zu and zeh. That zu is the feminine going on the yid, and zeh is going zeh keli vanveyu. And when we have the connection, the joining of the yid with Hashem, so that draws down the makif, and that is the protection for the Kabbalah soil. Or that is the protection that's engendered through the Kabbalah soil. He says in Oishei, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and of your houses and your gates. And we already mentioned this question earlier, that seemingly it's already a Jewish home. Why do you need to have a further thing to be done? Though it's a home of Kedusha, still and all, it's insufficient the fact that with wisdom the house is built, which means the Koiches Pnimim, that's not enough that we have the boin of boy. Without Hashem Yivna Bayis, we have the avoid of Torah, we have the avoid of Tefillah, but on top of that, an additional tzarech liyas amshach samakifim, there has to be the drawing down of the transcendent level through the mezuzah. Only through the mezuzah becomes the protection. Hashem will guard your goings and comings from now until forever. And in what type of way? Even though it says with the name Havaya, but it's really in a higher way. In the way that the Shomer Yisrael, which is higher than Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei, which the whole idea of sleep doesn't apply over there, will be manifest. The Inyan Zeh, this idea that we just now said, applies across all 3 categories like we mentioned before. It's both concerning the home of the general Seder Shtalshlus, the world, and the Seder Shtalshlus is called a home. Also concerning the individual home of every single Yid. And also concerning the avoid of a person, like was mentioned previously at length, about all these 3 levels of the bias. That's not sufficient just to have the bias of Kedusha. It's not just enough to have the Koiches Pnimim, the Oiris Pnimim, the Naran Chai, etc. We also need to have the higher than Seder Shtalshlus, which is the Mezuzah. Vaydezeh Nasa Gam Ha'inyan, the Lishmer Mezuzah is Psochai. through this becomes that a person guards, the Hashem says, that he's guarding the mezuzah of my entrances. That Hashem says that a person, so the pasuk is in Mishle, it says Ashri Adam Shmoyeli, he says on the left side, that fortunate is a person that listens to me, lishkoid al dalsoisa yoim yoim, to be diligent, to always go by my entrances, which means in a simple sense to go daven, to go learn, to go to Beis Knesses, Beis Medrash, to be there daily, lishmer mezuzas psachoi, to guard the doorposts of my entrances. Like it's brought down the Medrash, is there then a mezuzah on Batik Nesiyas? We're talking, like we said before, that the person is diligent in coming to shul, and we call that lishmer mezuzas psachoi. Is there, so the Chazal ask, the Medrash ask, is there then a mezuzah in the shul? Shari beis ha-knesses u beis ha-medrash poter b'mezuzah. Al pi halacha, both a shul and a place of study is not obligated in mezuzah, because they are both not considered a home. Only a place that's a home, a dwelling place, somewhere where people live, that is something that's obligated in mezuzah. Since a yeshiva, since a shul is not where a person lives, it's not obligated in the mezuzah. These days it's different because for whatever reason, either we say that people do end up living there or doing their own personal needs over there, etc. But minat Torah, mi'ikar adin, the shul and a yeshiva is not obligated in the mezuzah. So therefore, the Medrash goes on to say, what does it mean? That lishmer mezuzah psachoi, what does it mean to guard the mezuzahs of my entrances that Hashem says, top of the last page, just like this mezuzah does not ever move from the doorway. It always remains over there. Kach loy tehei zaz mibatik nesiyos ubatim medrashes. So too, we are compared to the mezuzahs, that just like the mezuzah, being the doorpost or a real mezuzah, what we call a mezuzah, doesn't leave the doorpost ever, so too the yid should not move mezuzah. Just like the mezuzah doesn't move, so too you should not leave my doorways, the shul and the yeshivas. Messiah, and the Medrash concludes, Maksiv Achrav, what does it say in the following pasuk over there in Mishlei? Ki moitzi motzachayim. Those that find me, in other words, those that come to daven, those that come to learn in the shul, in the yeshiva, so those who find me found life. Va'ad, to such degree, shemachaya chayim yitn lecha chayim. The one who gives life to all will give you life as well, to those that are following through on this. In such a manner that you are cleaving to Havaya, your God, you are alive. In other words, because of the cleaving to Hashem, the connection with Hashem, that's why you are alive. Until the completion and perfection of this will be with the coming of Mashiach. David, a person from the house of David, that even the Beis Hamikdash from Koima, he will build the Beis Hamikdash in its place, so because of Mamish, and soon Mamish.